In this video, we're looking at square root and the cube root. So a square root of a number is the value which squared gives that number. So remember, squaring a number means raising it to the power of 2. And also it is important to note that squaring and square rooting are what we call inverse or opposite operations, and essentially what that means is that they cancel each other out. So if you have a look at your my examples down here, if we had 4 squared, that's the same as saying 4 times 4, so we get 16. Now the square root of 16, it should be plus or minus there, equals plus or minus 4, because essentially what the square root does is it finds the number when multiplied by itself will get 16. So what that means is if I go, like we did up here, 4 times 4, we know that equals 16. Now the plus or minus is because if I go minus 4 times minus 4, I also get 16. So it's important to note that when you're square rooting something, your answer should be a plus or a minus, because both 4 times 4 can equal 16, but so does negative 4 times negative 4. Now, as I mentioned before, squaring and square rooting are inverse operations. So essentially, if I have something such as square root of 4 squared like that, this and this cancel out, and what is left over is the number that's inside, so the 4. Alright? Now that is what we call inverse operations, and that'll come in handy when you cover topics such as equations. The next thing we're going to look at is the cube root. Now the cube root of a number is the value when cubed gives that number, so multiplied by itself 3 times. Now remember, cubing a number means raising it to the power of 3, and similarly to that of square and square rooting, cubing and cube rooting are inverse operations and they cancel each other out. So here we have our examples. So we have 2 times 2 times 2, and that equals 8. So that is our cubing. Next down here we have the cube root of 8. So again, what number when multiplied by itself gets me to 8? Now, unlike the square root, that if the number inside the cube root is positive, it remains as positive when it comes out as an answer. If it was negative, it comes out as a negative. Now that's important, because if I go 2 times 2 times 2, that gets me 8. But if I go negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, that actually gets me negative 8, which is not what we got. Alright? So, it's important to note that. So, and lastly, like I said, cubing and cube rooting are inverse operations. So, if I had our cube root here, this cancels this out, and we're left over with what the number was on the inside. In this case, it was 8. So we're going to look at some questions. So we're going to evaluate the square root of 36. Now you can use a calculator to do this. And if you're using a Casio, the button looks like this. Alright, so that there is our square root button. And all you need to do is press that button, put in 36, click equals, and it will come out with a number like that. Now it's important to remember that you need to add the plus or minus there, because remember, if I have minus 6 times minus 6, that gets me 36, but if I have 6 times 6, that also gets me 36. So it's important to remember you need to add that plus or minus out the front. So here we have another one, and it's the same thing. You would press your square root button, you would put in your 225, and you'll get an answer of 15, and remember we add our plus or minus. So next we're going to look at our first cube root. Now we do have a negative in here. Now again, you can use a calculator. So your cube root button looks like this. So sometimes you'll have to press your shift button first, and then press your square root button. At least on the Casio, if you do that, you will get your cube root. Alright, it doesn't have a specific button for itself. We need to click shift and then the square root button. Once you do that, you would put in your negative 125, and our answer will be negative 5, which makes sense because when I said you put a negative in, you get a negative out with cube roots. So the next thing we're looking at is the cube root of 64. So again, if you're using a Casio, you can press Shift, then the square root button, and you'll get your cube root. Then you would put in 64, click equals, and you'll get your answer of 4. So 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. So to recap, remember your square root of a number is the value which, when squared, gives that number. And it's important to remember that's a plus or minus answer, because let's say 3 times minus 3, that gets me 9, but so does 3 times 3. Now, cube root of a number is the value which, when cubed, gives that number. So if I had 3 times 3 times 3, that's 27. So the cube root of 27 is 3.